Seo Kang-rim's world was a monochromatic fortress of power and prejudice, until Ayaan Hassan walked in wearing red and burned his rules to the ground. At 38, Kang-rim was a man who lived by the iron algorithm of efficiency, governed by a clock that never faltered and a bottom line that never bled. He was the architect of a tech empire that spanned continents, but his personal world was a sanctuary of rigid tradition. His father had taught him early on that power required a specific, untainted image, and somewhere in those cold lessons he had forged a steel-clad vow. He would never love a black woman. He viewed them as a chaotic distraction, a splash of unpredictable color that had no place in his orderly, monochromatic life. It wasn't an act of animosity. It was worse. He simply dismissed them, looking through the sea of humanity as if they were data points to be filtered out of his reality. The Grand Palace Hotel rooftop was a monument to excessive elegance, a sea of black tuxedos and whispered billion-dollar deals beneath the shimmering Seoul skyline. Kang-rim stood near the marble pillars, his posture as rigid as his convictions, scanning the elite crowd with intense, calculating eyes. He had already exchanged mandatory pleasantries with ministers and turned down 3 partnership offers that lacked vision. Everything was proceeding according to the rhythm he had dictated for himself. Routine, predictable, and entirely under his command. Then, the doors at the far end of the ballroom swung open, and the rhythm of his world shattered. Ayaan Hassan didn't just enter the room. She commanded the atmosphere. In a backless red evening gown that burned like a wildfire against the night sky, she was a vision of effortless, regal elegance. Her skin was luminous under the crystal chandeliers, and she moved with a quiet, intimate power that seemed to ignore his cold aura entirely. For the first time in his life, Kang-rim felt a visceral glitch in his controlled world. His pulse, usually a steady drumbeat of calculation, began to thrum with a dangerous, magnetic heat. He told himself to look away, to return to the safety of his grayscale walls, but his eyes refused to obey. They clung to her like iron to a magnet. As she made her way through the room, her gaze met his, and the walls he had spent decades building didn't just crack, they began to burn. In that single, breathtaking moment, the ruthless boss realized that his only weakness had finally arrived, and she was wearing red. Seo Kang-rim sat in his 88th floor office, the floor-to-ceiling glass walls framing a soul that seemed to tremble beneath his feet. To the world, he was the iron algorithm, a man whose brain functioned with the cold, frictionless speed of the quantum processors his company manufactured. Silence was his preferred atmosphere, a heavy, pressurized quiet that forced his subordinates to weigh every syllable before they dared to speak. He didn't believe in the messy turbulence of human emotion. He believed in data, in leverage, and in the inevitable victory of the better-coded plan. The merger is at 92%, his chief operations officer whispered, standing exactly 3 feet from the desk, careful not to break the invisible perimeter of Kang-rim's personal space. The rival firm is begging for a grace period. They say their employees need more time to transition. Kang-rim didn't look up from his screen. His sharp, impeccably groomed features remained as still as a marble bust, the light of the monitors reflecting in his intense, unblinking eyes. Begging is not a business strategy, he replied, his voice a low, melodic blade. They had 6 months to adapt. They failed. Execute the acquisition by midnight. I want their patents liquidated and their board dismissed. I don't pay for excuses. I pay for results. There was no cruelty in his tone, only the clinical finality of a machine. This was the life he had been engineered for by a father who viewed empathy as a system error. From a young age, Kang-rim had been taught that a legacy was a fortress, and every stone had to be perfect. His father's voice still echoed in the back of his mind, a constant reminder that power required a specific, untainted aesthetic. Within that fortress, There was no room for the unpredictable. This was why he had forged his most private vow. He would never allow a distraction into his life, specifically the vibrant, chaotic beauty of black women. In the rigid, monochromatic world of the Seo family, they were viewed as a cultural and social disruption, a variable that could not be accounted for in his father's long-term equations. To Kang-rim, they were a world apart, a noise he had successfully filtered out for nearly 4 decades. He had convinced himself that his heart was a closed circuit, a sequence of binary commands that sought only expansion and control. He was the Ice King, secure in his frozen kingdom, never suspecting that the algorithm of his life was about to encounter a force it wasn't programmed to handle. The Grand Palace Hotel was a monument to the very things Seo Kang-rim understood best: precision, luxury, and the silent language of power. The rooftop was bathed in a curated golden glow, where thousands of fairy lights draped across trellises and crystal chandeliers hung like frozen stars over velvet lounges. Below, the Seoul skyline stretched into the distance, a jagged painting of neon and glass reflected in the dark ribbon of the Han River. Kang-rim stood near the stone balustrade, a glass of vintage scotch in his hand, his sharp features illuminated by the flickering city lights. He moved through these circles with the ease of a predator in a familiar forest, his black tuxedo impeccably tailored, his aura so cold that a visible path seemed to clear whenever he moved. He had spent the last hour navigating the summit's opening gala with surgical efficiency. He had exchanged exactly 3 minutes of conversation with the Minister of Trade, successfully ignored 2 investment bankers who lacked the capital to interest him, and endured a polite but hollow greeting from a tech rival whose stocks he planned to crush by the following quarter. For Kang-rim, these events were not for pleasure. They were a showcase of his absolute control. His world was monochromatic, a sanctuary of black suits, white contracts, and grayscale logic. He was the Ice King, and his throne was built on the certainty that nothing and no one could ever disrupt the steady, binary rhythm of his heart. Then, the doors to the terrace swung open, and the algorithm of his life encountered its first fatal error. The first thing Kang-rim noticed was the color. In a room of muted charcoals and safe pastels, she was a wildfire. Ayaan Hassan didn't just walk into the room. She took ownership of the atmosphere. She wore a backless red evening gown of deep satin that clung to her curves with effortless grace, the fabric shimmering like liquid rubies under the chandeliers. Her skin was luminous, a rich, dark contrast to the vibrant silk, and her hair was swept into an elegant bun that accentuated the regal line of her neck. Kang-rim felt a visceral, magnetic pull that he was entirely unprepared for. He told himself to look away, to return to his glass of scotch and his thoughts of market shares, but his eyes refused to obey. He watched, mesmerized as she navigated the crowd. There was no trace of the nervous posturing he usually saw in those trying to impress the Seoul elite. Instead, she moved with a quiet, intimate power, her head held high, her lips curved into a polite but measured smile that suggested she was the one weighing the room, not the other way around. As she moved closer to the bar, Kang-rim's hand tightened around his glass. He felt a strange, dangerous tension in his chest, a glitch in the system he had spent decades perfecting. His pulse, which usually followed the predictable beat of a calculated plan, began to thrum with a heat that made the cold night air feel stifling. He had spent his life dismissing women like her, categorizing them as a noise to be filtered out. Yet here she was the only thing he could see. The distance between them closed until she was standing just a few feet away, ordering a drink with a voice that was low and melodic like velvet over steel. Kang-rim straightened his jacket, his rigid posture betraying the sudden, uncharacteristic tremor in his nerves. For the first time in 38 years, the ruthless boss felt physically shaken. She turned then, her gaze sweeping the terrace until it landed on him. Her eyes were intense, carrying both warmth and an undeniable strength that met his cold aura without flinching. In that moment of eye contact, the walls of pride and prejudice that Kang-rim had built around his soul didn't just crack, they began to burn. The red disruption had arrived, and as the Ice King stared into the eyes of the woman he had sworn he would never love, he realized with a terrifying clarity that his world would never be monochromatic again. Seo Kang-rim sat behind his obsidian desk, the floor-to-ceiling glass of the Seo Tower framing a soul that seemed to shiver beneath a heavy charcoal sky. He had not slept. For the first time in 38 years, the iron algorithm had encountered a sequence he couldn't solve. The image of Ayaan Hassan in her liquid ruby gown from the summit was a persistent, burning glitch in his mind, a distraction that threatened the monochromatic order of his life. To Kang-rim, there was only one way to handle a threat to his control. He would either delete it, or he would possess it until it no longer had the power to move him. Prepare the acquisition documents for Hassan Global Architecture, he commanded, his voice a low, clinical blade. He didn't look at his assistant. He was staring at a digital rendering of Ayaan's firm. And schedule a private meeting with their CEO for 11 o'clock. Here, in my sanctuary. His plan was simple. He would buy her. He would offer a sum so staggering, so undeniably excessive, that would effectively end her independence and relegate her to a distant wing of his empire. In his mind, this wasn't just a business move. It was an emotional exorcism. He had been raised to believe that a man of his stature, a guardian of Korean traditionalism and corporate purity, had no business letting his pulse quicken for a woman who lived so far outside his orderly rhythm. By owning her firm, he would turn a magnetic obsession into a manageable line item on a balance sheet. When the clock struck 11, Ayaan Hassan walked into the boardroom. She had traded the red satin for a charcoal gray power suit, the fabric tailored with such sharp precision it rivaled his own. Yet, the poise remained, regal, effortless, and entirely unimpressed by the pressurized silence of his 88th floor fortress. "Mr. Seo," she greeted, choosing the seat directly across from him without waiting for an invitation. She met his intense, unblinking gaze with a calm strength that made the air in the room feel thin and electric. "Miss Hassan," Kang-rim replied, sliding a thick leather folder across the polished table. "I don't believe in wasting time. Your firm has potential, but it lacks the capital and the infrastructure to survive the next quarter of global tech integration. My offer is 3 times your current market valuation. In exchange, I want total control of Hassan Global and your exclusive services as an internal lead." It was an ambush of gold. He waited for the flicker of greed, the hesitation, or the intimidation that usually followed his ruthless maneuvers. He wanted to see her bow to the logic of his wealth and the weight of his legacy. Instead, Ayaan didn't even open the folder. She leaned back, her lips curving into a polite, knowing smile that hit him with more force than the acquisition papers ever could. "You want to buy me, Kang-rim, because you don't know how to deal with the fact that I'm the only person in this city who isn't afraid of you," she said softly, her dark eyes narrowing with amusement. "But if you had actually analyzed my firm's philosophy instead of just my tax returns, you'd realize that I'm not here to be bought. I'm here because your current tech infrastructure is dying of stagnation." For the next 30 minutes, the unyielding architect dismantled the Seo Empire's expansion strategy with surgical brilliance. She pointed out inefficiencies in his quantum processing cooling systems that his own engineers had overlooked for months. She spoke of human-centric design and digital souls, concepts that Kang-rim had long dismissed as sentimental noise, but she presented them with a cold, mathematical logic that he couldn't refute. As she spoke, the iron algorithm felt a visceral shift. He found himself truly listening, not looking for a weakness to exploit, but feeling a profound, terrifying admiration. She wasn't a distraction to be deleted. She was the missing variable he hadn't known he was searching for. Her brilliance was a wildfire, and for the first time in his life, Kang-rim realized that his monochromatic world wasn't a fortress. It was a prison of his own making. "Your offer is generous, Mr. CEO," she said, finally standing up and sliding the unopened folder back toward him. "But I don't work for men who want to hide me in their subsidiaries to protect their ego. I work with visionaries who want to change the world. Call me when you decide which one you are." She turned and walked out, her heels clicking a rhythmic challenge against the marble floor. Kang-rim sat in the heavy silence, staring at the leather folder. He had come to the table to conquer her, but as he watched her disappear through the glass doors, he realized he had never felt more defeated or more alive. The Ice King was still sitting on his throne, but the frost was starting to melt. The 88th floor of the CO Tower was a sanctuary of silence, but at midnight, the pressurized stillness felt different. Usually, Seo Kang-rim found comfort in the isolation of these hours. It was the only time the iron algorithm could process the day's data without the interference of subordinates or the weight of his family's expectations. But tonight, the air was thick with a new kind of static. Across the polished obsidian of the holographic table, Ayaan Hassan was leaning over a 3D rendering of their joint project, her brow furrowed in a rare moment of intense concentration. The moonlight through the floor-to-ceiling windows caught the sharp line of her profile, making her luminous skin glow against the backdrop of the Seoul skyline. She had discarded her blazer hours ago, her silk blouse draped elegantly as she moved digital blueprints with a flick of her wrist. Kang-rim stood a few feet away, supposedly reviewing the structural integrity of the atrium, but his eyes were trapped in a loop. He was watching the way her fingers danced across the light, precise, creative, and entirely unafraid. He was watching the way she hummed softly, a low, melodic vibration that bypassed his logic and went straight to his nerves. "The thermal load here is still too high, Kang-rim," she said, her voice like velvet cutting through the hum of the servers. She used his name with a casual confidence that still sent a jolt through his system. In his world, he was a title, a position, a pillar of stone. To her, he was simply a man who needed to fix a calculation. "If we don't adjust the glass opacity in the East Wing, the sustainable soul of this building becomes a furnace by mid-afternoon. The algorithm suggests a 70% tint for maximum efficiency," he replied, his voice sounding more like a low rasp than he intended. He stepped closer, intending to point at the holographic interface, but as he reached out, his hand brushed against hers. The contact was brief, a mere spark of skin against skin, but it felt like a system-wide failure. Kang-rim froze. He was a man who viewed touch as a transactional necessity, a handshake, a formal greeting, a distance maintained. But this was magnetic. The heat of her hand against the cold, digital interface was a contradiction he couldn't resolve. Ayaan didn't pull away immediately. She looked up, her dark, intense eyes searching his face, and for the first time, the intellectual sparring they had engaged in for weeks felt like a thin veil for something much more dangerous. "You're overthinking the numbers again," she whispered, her gaze dropping to his lips before returning to his eyes. "Some things can't be calculated, Kang-rim. They have to be felt. You've spent so much time building walls to protect your legacy that you've forgotten how to actually live in the structures you create." The distance between them vanished, as if drawn by a vacuum. Kang-rim felt the iron algorithm crash entirely. The monochromatic world he had built to keep the chaos out was dissolving under the steady, radiant warmth of her presence. He realized then that he didn't want the negotiation to end. He didn't want the project to finish. He wanted to understand the mystery of the woman who had turned his only weakness into his only obsession. "I'm beginning to think," Kang-rim said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper as he leaned in, his breath hitching as her scent, sandalwood and something uniquely hers, filled his lungs, that my father's equations were missing the most important variable. He didn't pull away this time. Instead, he let his hand linger, his thumb tracing the back of her wrist, feeling the frantic, matching rhythm of her pulse. At midnight, in the heart of the empire he had built on cold logic, the ruthless boss finally stopped calculating and began to burn. The silence of the room was no longer hollow. It was a heavy, electric promise that the Ice King had finally found the one force he could neither possess nor ignore. The drive to the Seo ancestral estate took them away from the neon pulse of Seoul and into the long, creeping shadows of the surrounding mountains. Kang-rim drove in a silence that felt heavier than usual, his hands steady on the leather-wrapped wheel, but his mind was a storm of uncharacteristic hesitation. He had never brought a woman here. He had never brought anyone here who wasn't essential to the cold, mechanical gears of his family's legacy. This was the source code of the iron algorithm, the place where the ice had first been etched into his bones. Ayaan sat beside him, her presence a vibrant, defiant anomaly against the dark interior of the car. She didn't press him for conversation, sensing the gravity of the destination. As the gates of the estate swung open, massive, wrought iron structures that hissed with a mechanical precision, the house finally came into view. It was a masterpiece of minimalist architecture, all sharp angles of gray stone and vast, unblinking expanses of glass, perched on a cliffside like a silent observer of the valley below. It was beautiful, but it was a beauty that lacked breath. It was a monument to order, devoid of the messy, colorful evidence of a life actually lived. "It's like a museum," Ayaan whispered as they stepped into the foyer. The floors were polished white marble, so sterile they seemed to hang in a permanent, artificial chill. There were no family photos on the walls, no scattered books, no warmth of a fireplace. There were only ancient artifacts in illuminated glass cases and portraits of stern, unyielding men in traditional robes who looked down with a gaze of permanent judgment. Kang-rim led her through the long, echoing corridors. "My father believed that a home should be a reflection of one's discipline," he said, his voice sounding hollow in the vast space. He said that clutter in the house led to clutter in the mind. Every room was designed to be a lesson in restraint and an exercise in perfection. He stopped at the entrance to a large clinical dining room. A massive mahogany table sat in the center, long enough to seat 20, but it looked as though it had never hosted a celebration or a raised voice. "I sat here every morning from the age of 5, Kang-rim said, his gaze fixed on the head of the table. "My father would sit there, and my tutor would sit beside me. I wasn't allowed to eat until I had recited the day's market fluctuations or translated a passage of classical text. If I made a mistake, the plate was removed. He called it tempering the blade. He believed that a CEO did not deserve to be fed if his mind was not sharp." Ayaan walked to the table, her hand tracing the cold, dark wood. She looked at him, and for the first time, her eyes weren't just challenging, they were mourning. "And your mother? Where was she while the blade was being tempered?" "She followed the rhythm," Kang-rim replied, his jaw tightening until the bone was visible. "She was a ghost in this house, moving through the halls with a silence that was expected of her. She didn't offer comfort because comfort was seen as a system error. In this world, Ayaan, love was a variable that didn't balance the equation. It was a weakness that had to be purged to ensure the strength of the lineage. He led her further into the house, eventually reaching a small, glass-walled study that overlooked the darkened valley. This had been his private sanctuary, the place where he had spent thousands of hours perfecting the code and the strategies that would eventually build his empire. "I used to sit here and watch the lights of the city," he admitted, his voice dropping to a low rasp. "I used to think that if I built something big enough, something powerful enough, the silence of this house wouldn't feel so heavy. I thought I could outrun the cold by becoming the ice itself." Ayaan moved closer to him, her warmth radiating in the sterile room. She didn't offer him pity. She knew he would find it insulting. Instead, she reached out and took his hand, her fingers interlacing with his in a deliberate defiance of the room's rigid history. The touch was electric, a rich, dark contrast to the monochromatic perfection of the marble and glass. "You build a fortress to protect a child who was never allowed to cry," she said softly, her thumb tracing the back of his hand. "But a fortress is also a tomb, Kang-rim. You've been living in the frost for so long you've forgotten what it feels like to breathe. You aren't the ice. You're the fire that's been trapped beneath it." Kang-rim looked down at their joined hands. The sight was a glitch in everything he had been taught to believe. For 38 years, he had been a man of stone, a machine of binary logic who dismissed anything that didn't fit the perfect Korean legacy. But in the heart of the home that had tried to break his spirit, he realized he hadn't brought her here to show off his wealth. He had brought her here to show her the wound he had spent his life hiding. The silence of the estate was still there, heavy and unyielding, but as he stood there with Ayaan, the cold didn't feel so absolute. The iron algorithm was finally crashing, replaced by a singular human truth. He didn't want to be the architect of a frozen empire anymore. He wanted to be the man who deserved the warmth of the woman who had seen through his armor. As he looked into her eyes, the Ice King realized that the only thing more terrifying than losing his control was the thought of living another day without her. The boardroom of the CO Tower was a chamber of pressurized silence, a space where the air always felt a few degrees colder than the rest of the world. It was a cathedral of glass and obsidian, designed to make anyone who entered feel the crushing weight of the CO legacy. Today, the atmosphere was not merely cold. It was clinical. The old guard, 7 men who had been the architects of his father's era, sat around the polished table like statues of a dying age. At the center sat Chairman Min, a man whose hair was as silver as the scalpels he used to dissect corporate rivals. He had been the one to mentor Kang-rim in the art of the iron algorithm, and today his gaze was as sharp and unforgiving as a winter morning in the mountains. Kang-rim walked to the head of the table, his footsteps echoing with a rhythmic, unhurried precision. He didn't offer a greeting. In this room, pleasantries were viewed as a system error. He simply sat, his posture as rigid as the steel beams holding up the 88 floors beneath them. "Kang-rim," Chairman Min began, his voice a low, melodic rasp that carried the weight of 4 decades of authority. "We have observed a recent shift in the firm's trajectory. The collaboration with Hassan Global was presented as a strategic necessity, a way to acquire new architectural soul for our hardware. We sanctioned it because the data suggested an expansion of our influence." He paused, his eyes narrowing as they searched Kang-rim's inscrutable face. "But the data is being corrupted by a personal variable. The red disruption is no longer a secret, and the whispers in the capital are becoming a roar. The partnership has already improved our thermal efficiency by 12%, Kang-rim replied, his voice a cool, steady stream of logic. Ayaan Hassan is not a variable. She is the solution to the stagnation this board has ignored for 5 years. If you're concerned about whispers, perhaps you should look at the increase in our pre-order metrics since the summit. A younger board member, a man who had been handpicked by Kang-rim's father to ensure purity in the ranks, leaned forward. This isn't about metrics, Kang-rim. This is about the image of the Seo name. You are the face of a traditional Korean dynasty. Your father built this empire on the bedrock of a specific, untainted legacy. To be seen, parading around with a woman like her, a woman who represents everything this house has spent decades distancing itself from, it creates a perception of instability. It suggests that the iron algorithm is malfunctioning. The words "a woman like her" hung in the air like a poisonous mist. Kang-rim felt a cold, dangerous fire ignite in his chest, a flicker of emotion that his father would have called a failure, but which felt more like a rebirth. He remembered the warmth of Ayaan's hand in the frozen halls of his childhood home, and the way her brilliance had made the board's traditional legacy look like a dusty, hollow museum. Perception is a tool, not a cage, Kang-rim said, his eyes locking onto the younger man with such intensity that the other looked away. If the board is more concerned with the color of my partner's skin than the strength of our global infrastructure, then it is the board that is malfunctioning. Chairman Min tapped a single, long finger against the obsidian table. The sound was as final as a gavel. Enough. We are not here to debate philosophy. We are here to protect the institution. The traditionalist investors are restless. They see this as a betrayal of the values your father instilled in you. They see her as a weakness, Kang-rim. And in this world, a leader with a visible weakness is a leader who is about to be replaced. Min leaned back, the shadows of the room deepening the lines on his face. The ultimatum is simple. Terminate the joint venture with Hassan Global. Sever all personal ties with the woman. Re-establish the monochromatic order of the CEO name by the end of the week, or the board will move for a vote of no confidence. We will not let your experimentation burn down the fortress we spent a lifetime building. Kang-rim stood up slowly, the silence of the room becoming a vacuum around him. He looked at the 7 men who had taught him that love was a variable to be purged and that humanity was a distraction from power. For 38 years, he had followed their rhythm. He had been the perfect, frozen prince of their monochromatic kingdom. But as he looked at Chairman Min, he realized that their fortress was actually a tomb, and he was no longer willing to be the ghost haunting its halls. You call her my weakness, Kang-rim said, his voice dropping to a low, melodic blade that made the old guard visibly stiffen. But you've been living in the frost for so long you've forgotten what it feels like to breathe. She isn't the distraction. She's the only thing in this room that's actually real. He turned and walked toward the door, his heart thrumming with a rhythm that was no longer an algorithm, but a choice. He knew that the moment he stepped out of this room, the war for his empire would begin. But as he thought of Ayaan, he realized that he didn't care about the throne anymore. He cared about the woman who had taught the Ice King how to burn. The Crystal Pavilion was a cathedral of light and glass, designed to reflect the absolute perfection of Seoul's elite. Tonight, it hosted the annual Heritage Auction, an event where influence was measured in millions and reputations were polished to a blinding sheen. The atmosphere was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and the low, melodic hum of high-stakes whispers. For Seo Kang-rim, this had always been a familiar battlefield. He stood at the edge of the ballroom, a glass of untouched champagne in his hand, his sharp features illuminated by the massive chandeliers. To the observers, he was still the iron algorithm, the ruthless tech titan who governed with cold precision. But beneath the surface of his impeccably tailored tuxedo, a dangerous, new heat was beginning to burn. Ayaan Hassan stood near the center of the room, a radiant anomaly in a sea of monochromatic gray and black. She wore a gown of deep emerald silk that seemed to drink in the light, her poise effortless as she navigated the subtle hostility of the crowd. Kang-rim watched her from the shadows, noticing the way the old guard board members, seated at the primary tables, tracked her with predatory eyes. They were waiting for her to stumble, for the red disruption to reveal a fatal flaw. The auctioneer's voice cut through the murmurs, announcing the evening's centerpiece, a rare, long-lost sketchbook belonging to a pioneer of modern African architecture. It was a collection of dreams, blueprints for cities that breathed and structures that honored the earth. Kang-rim saw the flicker of genuine longing in Ayaan's eyes. This wasn't just an object of wealth to her. It was a piece of her soul, a connection to the vision she was trying to build alongside him. We shall begin the bidding at 500 million won, the auctioneer declared. The bids climbed rapidly, the numbers flying like digital code. Ayaan raised her paddle with a steady hand, her face a mask of professional determination. She was bidding her own personal capital, a testament to her independence. But as the prize crossed the 2 billion mark, a new voice entered the fray. It was Director Choi, the youngest member of the old guard and the man who had most vocally challenged Kang-rim in the boardroom. He leaned back in his velvet chair, a smirk playing on his lips as he raised his paddle. 3 billion, Choi called out, his voice carrying a deliberate, mocking edge. He didn't want the sketchbook. He wanted to show Ayaan that in this room, her brilliance was nothing compared to the weight of traditional Korean capital. Ayaan hesitated, her jaw tightening. She knew Choi was playing a game of attrition. She raised her paddle one more time. 3.5 billion. 5 billion. Choi snapped back instantly, not even looking at the item. He turned toward his colleagues, a ripple of quiet laughter following his bid. He looked directly at Ayaan, his gaze dripping with a clinical elitism. Some things, Miss Hassan, are simply out of reach for those who do not truly belong in this circle. Perhaps you should stick to smaller, more appropriate ambitions. The room fell into a pressurized silence. It was a public execution of her dignity, a reminder from the old guard that they still controlled the monochromatic order of their world. Ayaan stood frozen, her hand lowering, her regal poise momentarily shaken by the sheer, unadulterated arrogance of the man. Kang-rim felt the last of his father's iron algorithm shatter within him. For 38 years, he had been a man of stone, a machine of binary logic who would never have risked his social standing for a distraction. But as he looked at Choi's smug expression and then at the quiet strength in Ayaan's eyes, he realized that the legacy he had been protecting was hollow. 10 billion won. Kang-rim's voice rang out, a low, melodic blade that sliced through the silence. The ballroom gasped as one. The auctioneer froze, his gavel hovering in midair. Kang-rim walked slowly from the shadows, stepping into the golden light of the center aisle. He didn't look at the auctioneer. He looked directly at Choi, his eyes burning with an icy fire that made the younger director visibly recoil. Mr. Seo, the auctioneer stammered. 10 billion. 15 billion, Kang-rim corrected, his voice steady and devoid of hesitation. It was a sum that made no financial sense, a bid that defied every rule of the algorithm he had once lived by. He stopped beside Ayaan, his presence a shield of cold authority. He didn't touch her, but the shift in his loyalty was as visceral as a physical blow. Kang-rim, what are you doing? Chairman Min whispered from the front table, his face pale with fury. This is madness. You are destroying your reputation for a book of sketches. Kang-rim turned his head slightly toward the old guard, his profile sharp and unyielding. I'm not buying a book, he said, his voice carrying to every corner of the pavilion. I am investing in a vision that none of you are brilliant enough to understand. And as for belonging, Director Choi, the only thing that doesn't belong in this room is the ignorance you've mistaken for tradition. 15 billion won, going once, twice. The gavel slammed down. Sold to Chairman Seo Kang-rim. The silence that followed was no longer pressurized. It was stunned. Kang-rim turned to Ayaan, his intense gaze softening for a fraction of a second. He took the sketchbook from the attendant and handed it to her, his fingers brushing hers in a deliberate, public act of intimacy. You told me that some things have to be felt, not calculated, he whispered, loud enough only for her to hear. I'm beginning to see that you were right. In that moment, the Ice King had finally chosen his side. He had burned the fortress of his father's pride to protect the woman who had taught him how to breathe. As they walked out of the crystal pavilion together, leaving the old guard in the wreckage of their own prejudice, Kang-rim knew the war for his empire had truly begun, and for the first time in his life, he didn't care about the cost of the victory. The morning sun hit the CO tower with a clinical, unforgiving brightness, but inside the penthouse, the atmosphere was already turning to ash. The headlines were a digital contagion, spreading across the news feeds of Seoul with the speed of a calculated virus. By dawn, the red disruption had been rebranded by the tabloids as a foreign infection. The scandal was meticulously crafted, a leaked dossier alleging that Ayaan Hassan had falsified her firm's credentials and that her previous project in Nairobi had been marred by corruption and personal misconduct. It was a professional assassination disguised as investigative journalism. Kang-rim stood in the center of his living room, the cold blue light of the morning city reflecting off his stone-cold features. On the marble counter, a tablet glowed with the face of Lee Min-hee, the woman his father had chosen for him years ago, a daughter of the powerful Daesung Group. She hadn't called him, but the fingerprints on the leak were unmistakable. It was her family's media wing that had broken the story. It was her brand of monochromatic revenge, a strike delivered with the elegance of a piano wire. Ayaan walked into the room, her steps slower than usual. She was holding her phone, her eyes red-rimmed, but her posture still holding that regal, terrifyingly fragile poise. She didn't look at the view of the city she was meant to help rebuild. She looked at the screen that was currently dismantling her life. "It's not true, Kang-rim," she said, her voice a hollowed-out version of the velvet melody he loved. "None of it. The Nairobi project was an award-winning success. The missing funds they're talking about were redirected into community housing by the local government. Not me. I have the audits, but in this city, nobody wants to see the audits. They only want to see the headline that confirms their worst suspicions about me." Kang-rim moved toward her, his instinct to solve the problem with the clinical finality of the iron algorithm. "I've already mobilized my legal team. By noon, we'll have a defamation suit filed against every outlet that ran this. By tonight, the Daesung Group will be under such intense regulatory scrutiny, they won't have time to print another word. I'll buy every advertising slot on every network to bury this." Ayaan looked up at him, and for the first time, there was a flicker of anger behind the hurt. "Is that your solution? To buy the silence? Kang-rim, look at what they're calling me. They aren't just attacking my business, they're attacking my soul. They're saying I'm a novelty. You're experimenting with the look modern. They're saying I don't belong in your world. And the worst part is the public believes them because they want to believe them." She stepped back, away from his reach, her hand trembling slightly. "Min-hee didn't do this just to hurt me. She did it to show you that I am a liability. She's using the very prejudice you once held to prove that I'm the mistake in your equation. And as long as you try to fix this with money and lawyers in the dark, you're proving her right. You're treating me like a PR crisis to be managed, not a woman you love." The silence that followed was visceral, heavier than any boardroom ultimatum Kang-rim had ever faced. He felt the sting of her words more than any physical blow. He realized she was right. His algorithm was trying to process a human tragedy as a system error. He wasn't defending Ayaan. He was defending his own sense of control. "I'm not a liability, Kang-rim," she whispered, a single tear finally breaking her composure. "But I won't stay in a fortress where I'm just a variable that needs to be protected from the light. I didn't come to Seoul to be your secret or your scandal. I came to be your equal." As she turned to leave the room, Kang-rim felt the ice in his chest finally shatter. He didn't think about the stock price, the traditionalist board, or the Daesung Group's influence. He only thought about the woman who had taught him how to breathe in a world of stone. He reached out, not to restrain her, but to pull her into a reality he was finally willing to own. "I don't care about the headline," he said, his voice dropping to a low, melodic blade of absolute certainty. "And I'm done fixing this in the shadows. If they want to see a scandal, let's give them the truth instead. I'm not managing a crisis, Ayaan. I'm standing with you. And before the sun sets, I'm going to make sure Min-hee and everyone else in this city understands that you aren't my weakness. You are the only thing that makes me strong." In that moment, the iron algorithm was officially offline. The Ice King was gone, replaced by a man who was ready to burn down his own legacy to protect the woman who had become his heart. The shadow of the X had tried to drive them apart, but it had only forced Kang-rim to step out of the shadows and into a fight he intended to win. The Great Hall of the Seoul Tech Summit was a digital coliseum, a a space of glass and steel where the air hummed with the electric tension of 1,000 cameras. Flash bulbs detonated like silent explosions, casting harsh, flickering shadows against the white-on-white minimalist stage. To the media, this was meant to be a routine announcement regarding the CO Tower's sustainable infrastructure. To the old guard board members watching from the front row, it was meant to be the day Seo Kang-rim finally performed the clinical surgery required to cut the red disruption out of his legacy. Kang-rim stood in the wings, his sharp features illuminated by the blue light of a monitor. He was perfectly groomed, his black tuxedo a masterpiece of unyielding tailoring. But his pulse was no longer following the steady, binary rhythm of the iron algorithm. He looked across the backstage area to where Ayaan stood. She was wearing a suit of deep, midnight blue, her regal poise intact even as she stared at the tablet in her hand, watching the live-streamed vitriol that Lee Min-hee's scandal had unleashed. He walked toward her, the sound of his footsteps lost in the roar of the crowd outside. He didn't offer words of comfort. He simply reached out and took her hand, his fingers interlacing with hers with a grip that was as much a promise as it was a grounding force. Ayaan looked up, her dark eyes searching his face, looking for the Ice King she had first met. She found instead a man who looked like he was ready to set his own throne on fire. "They are waiting for a concession," she whispered, her voice a low, velvet warning. "The board, the press, the public. They want you to apologize for the error of choosing me." "Then I'm about to give them a very different kind of data," Kang-rim replied, his voice a low, melodic blade. He stepped onto the stage alone. The roar of the crowd died down into a pressurized silence. He walked to the center of the podium, his posture rigid, his intense eyes scanning the sea of reporters as if he were analyzing their very souls. He didn't look at his teleprompter. He didn't look at the script his PR team had spent all night drafting. He simply gripped the edges of the lectern and leaned into the silence. "For 38 years, I have been a man of equations," Kang-rim began, his voice carrying to the back of the hall with a chilling clarity. "I was raised to believe that a leader must be a fortress, monochromatic, predictable, and devoid of the messy variables of human emotion. I was taught that my heritage was a boundary, and that anyone who looked or lived outside that boundary was a distraction to be dismissed. I was a man of prejudice, hidden behind the mask of professionalism." A collective gasp rippled through the hall. In the front row, Chairman Min's face turned a dangerous shade of gray. This wasn't a concession, it was a confession. "I swore I would never let a woman like Ayaan Hassan into my world," Kang-rim continued, his gaze narrowing as it locked onto the main camera lens. "I viewed her brilliance as a threat to my order, and her presence as a glitch in my algorithm. I lived in the frost for so long that I forgot what it felt like to breathe. But the scandal you see on your screens today isn't about her firm's integrity or her past. It is about your fear. It is about the old guard's fear that the Ice King has finally found something more powerful than their stone legacy." He paused, the silence in the room so heavy it felt as if the very walls were leaning in to listen. "They told me that she was my weakness," he said, his voice dropping to a low rasp of absolute certainty. "They told me that by standing with her, I was making myself vulnerable to my enemies. And they were right. She is my only weakness. She is the only person in this world who has the power to shatter my control and make me face the man I was hiding beneath the armor." He turned slightly, gesturing for Ayaan to join him on stage. She walked out with a quiet, intimate power, the midnight blue of her suit a rich contrast to the stark white lights. Kang-rim didn't wait for her to reach the podium. He met her halfway, taking her hand in front of 1 billion viewers. "But what they failed to calculate," Kang-rim said, looking directly at the board members, "is that the woman who is my greatest weakness is also the only reason I am finally strong. Ayaan Hassan didn't just design a building. She redesigned my soul. She taught me that a legacy built on exclusion is a tomb, not a fortress. If being a leader means returning to the monochromatic cold, then I am finished with it. Because I would rather burn down every floor of the CO tower than spend another second in a world where she isn't by my side. The flashbulbs erupted in a frenzied, chaotic storm. The hall descended into an uproar of questions and shouted headlines, but Kang-rim didn't hear them. He only felt the warmth of Ayaan's hand and the steady, human rhythm of his own heart. The iron algorithm was officially dead. The Ice King had made his stand, and as he walked off the stage with Ayaan, leaving his empire in the wreckage of his own truth, he realized he had never felt more powerful. He had traded his throne for his humanity, and for the first time in his life, the equation finally balanced. The snow fell over Seoul like a curtain of fine lace, dusting the sharp, geometric lines of the newly completed Hassan Seo Pavilion. It was a structure that shouldn't have existed according to the old rules, a daring fusion of high-tech glass and warm, organic curves that breathe alongside the city. Today, the pavilion was not a corporate monument, but a sanctuary of light and color, defiant against the monochromatic traditions that had once governed Seo Kang-rim's life. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of jasmine and sandalwood, a rich, fragrant rebellion against the clinical silence of the world he had left behind. Kang-rim stood at the altar, his posture still possessing that regal, unyielding precision, but the iron algorithm was nowhere to be found. He wore a traditional Korean hanbok of deep midnight blue, but it was adorned with intricate, hand-woven patterns from Nairobi, a visual vow that his legacy was no longer a fortress of exclusion. His intense eyes, once scanners for market fluctuations and tactical weaknesses, were fixed solely on the heavy oak doors at the end of the aisle. His pulse, which had once followed the binary rhythm of a machine, now thrummed with a frantic, human heat that he no longer sought to control. When the doors finally swung open, the collective breath of Seoul's elite hitched in a single, pressurized moment. Ayaan Hassan didn't just walk into the room, she transformed it. She was a vision of radiant, global grace, wearing a gown of white silk that transitioned into a magnificent train of crimson and gold, mirroring the red disruption that had burned down Kang-rim's old world. Her poise was effortless, her dark skin luminous against the white gold light of the chandeliers. She walked toward him not as a conquest or a liability, but as the architect of his redemption. The old guard sat in the front rows, their faces masks of stunned, silent observation. Chairman Min and the other directors who had once issued ultimatums were now merely witnesses to the end of their era. Kang-rim didn't look at them. He didn't look at the cameras that were broadcasting this breach of tradition to every corner of the globe. He only saw Ayaan. When she reached him, he took her hands, and the touch was the final confirmation of his transformation. For 38 years, he had been a man of stone, a prisoner of a perfect legacy that had sought to purge the soul from the man. But as he looked into Ayaan's eyes, he spoke his vows not from a script, but from the raw, unshielded truth of his heart. I once lived in a world of equations where love was a variable to be deleted. Kang-rim's voice rang out, low and melodic, carrying a weight of absolute sincerity that silenced even the skeptics. I built a fortress of ice to protect a child who was never allowed to feel, and I called it kingdom. But you walked in my world and taught me that a fortress is just a tomb with a different name. You didn't just challenge my logic, you redesigned my soul. Today, I don't offer you a throne or a monochromatic legacy. I offer you my life, my weakness, and the fire you started in me that I never want to put out. Ayaan's voice was a velvet melody, trembling with a fierce, joyful strength as she replied. You were a man who feared the light because you thought it would melt your empire. But you chose to stand in the sun with me anyway. I don't want to be your distraction, Kang-rim. I want to be your home. I choose you today, tomorrow, and through every rhythm our new world creates. When they kissed, the silence of the pavilion didn't just break, it erupted. It was a sound of 1,000 rules shattering at once. As they walked back down the aisle together, hand in hand, the ruthless boss smiled, a genuine, unrestrained expression of humanity that the world had never seen. The iron algorithm was dead, replaced by a new legacy defined by the courage to love outside the lines. As they stepped out into the crisp Seoul air, the city lights reflecting in the snow, Kang-rim realized that he hadn't lost his empire at all. He had simply finally found something worth ruling for. The Ice King had found his soul, and as he looked at the woman by his side, he knew that their story wasn't an ending, but the first brilliant page of a world that was finally beautifully colorful.